Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our HoUSed call this afternoon. We're going to hold on for just a minute as lots of people are still logging in. We'll give it a minute or two for them to do so, and we'll be right back with you. Lots of people are still logging into the call, so again, we'll give it maybe one more minute before we jump in. Okay, people are still joining us, but why don't we go ahead and get started? So welcome to today's National HoUSed Campaign call for universal, stable, affordable housing. I'm Paul Keeley, the Chief Operating Officer at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Welcome, we have a great call today. We're going to be joined by Senator Patty Murray, Democrat from Washington, to talk about enacting the Build Back Better Act and its really historic housing investments. We'll also be joined today's call by Eric Tarz from the National Homelessness Law Center, who will discuss state-level criminalization of homelessness. We'll get updates on NLIC's End Rental Arrears to Stop Evictions project and the most recent Treasury emergency rental assistance spending data. Sarah Sadian will join us to discuss the latest developments on the historic housing investments in Build Back Better and some other updates from Capitol Hill. We'll talk about ongoing advocacy needed to ensure the Build Back Better bill is passed. We'll get updates from the field and much more. So we're going to get started in just a second. I just want to remind everybody that there'll be an option for you to ask questions of our speakers and panelists. I do ask that you put those in the Q&A box that you'll see at the very bottom of your screen. There's also a chat function, which will be for you to share information, resources, comment with other participants. But again, if you have a question for one of our speakers or one of our panels, please do enter that in the Q&A box. That's generally where I'll be looking most to see if we have any questions that that our speakers, panelists can respond to. All right, so without further ado, we're going to jump right into it. And Sarah Sadian, our Vice President for Public Policy, will join us now to talk a little bit about what's going on Capitol Hill with Build Back Better and other issues. Sarah, take it away.
Great. Hey, Paul, thanks for having me on. It feels like we have been waiting and waiting and then waiting some more and then waiting a little bit more to get Congress to pass the Build Back Better Act. As you guys know, in mid-November, on November 19th, the House passed their version of the Build Back Better Act. And since then, it has been with the Senate as they continue to negotiate over different elements in the economic recovery package, and as they work with the parliamentarian to make sure that they've crossed their T's and dotted their I's to make sure everything is in line for a vote. The problem is that that timeline keeps slipping, and it could very well push into the new year. Originally, Senator Schumer said that he wanted to bring the bill to a vote on the floor next week, the week of December 13th, but that seems less and less likely. Earlier today, Senator Schumer sent out a letter saying that their goal is to finish things up so they could have a vote the week of the 20th. So even he is seeing that timeline push back. There are still a number of outstanding issues around the state and local tax deduction, climate change provisions, paid family leave, et cetera, and that they're still working with the parliamentarians. So things are taking time. I will say that we haven't heard about any further changes to the housing piece, so that's good to know. But there are a lot of big questions that haven't been answered. One of them also, those unanswered questions, is what Sinema and Manchin will do. They both keep trying to push this bill into January. Neither of them have committed to voting for the bill. Senator Manchin has raised concerns about this Omicron new wave of COVID infections, worried about what impact that could have on the stock market. It's possible that he could be trying to buy some time to wait until the Bureau of Labor Statistics puts out more information about inflation, which is their report is supposed to come out next week. All of that is going on. And at the same time, Congress is being delayed in passing other must-pass legislation. So for example, they were trying to work on a defense authorization bill last week. That got held up. This week, Congress has to start focusing on the debt ceiling, which runs out December 15th, and which Republicans haven't agreed to a solution yet. So all of that means that the timeline is getting pushed back. There's a really short window of opportunity for Democrats to get everything that they need done, and just only so many days to do it. So the best case scenario, sorry, at this point looks like a vote in the Senate the week of December 20th. Schumer has said over and over again that he will have a vote on the floor by Christmas. I haven't heard anything otherwise, so I think we have to hold him to that. The other thing to keep in mind, the only thing that's really keeping Democrats to the end of the year is an expiration of the child tax credit expansion that was included in the American Rescue Plan. So if they don't want to see any gap in terms of those resources for households, they're going to have to pass something by the end of the year. We're starting to see the House respond as well. The House was supposed to go on recess, but they pushed that back also to the week of the 20th. My guess is that if the Senate does decide to move this year, that either the House will stay in session to get it done, or maybe they'll go out of town and come back for their vote. But we do know that a second vote in the House is going to be necessary, because we know that the Senate is going to make changes to the version that had passed through the House earlier in November. Excuse me. So there is this continued delay, and I think that for us, or for me, I'll say, what this really drives home is how important it is for advocates to be putting as much pressure as possible on Congress to finish this process and finally enact the Build Back Better Act and its historic investments in housing. So that means that this time between now and when they pass the bill, hopefully at the end of the month, maybe into January, this is a really critical time for advocates to be making phone calls to their members of Congress, going to town hall meetings, emailing the staffers, doing whatever it is that you can be doing to put pressure on them to respond to the fact that they need to pass this bill. As a reminder, the bill includes about $150 billion in affordable housing, which is a huge amount of resources. And it also includes our top three priorities that we've all been pushing for: $25 billion to expand rental assistance to 300,000 households, $65 billion to preserve public housing for its 2 million residents, and $15 billion through the National Housing Trust Fund to build or preserve 150,000 homes for people with the greatest needs. And all of us know that those resources are really critical to addressing housing instability in our communities, but we need Congress to know that. And so over the next few weeks, I encourage you to be loud and consistent and tenacious in calling your members of Congress and really putting pressure on them to understand both why these resources are needed, but also that they need to act now and we can't afford to wait any longer. In terms of who to be contacting, again, this is purely a Democratic only game. Democrats are using a process called budget reconciliation. We've talked about that before, but that basically means that they can pass the bill with just 50 votes in the Senate. They have 50 votes in the Senate, which means every single Democrat is needed. So don't worry if you're not living in West Virginia or Arizona, where Manchin and Sinema are. We need you to be talking to your members of Congress, whether, especially Democrats in both the House and the Senate. They have very little margin of error for this bill. And so every single one of you has a role to play in making sure that we can get this across the finish line. I also wanted to talk a little bit about a CR, a continuing resolution that was passed last week by Congress to keep the government open through February 18th. This essentially gives them more time to come to an agreement on spending bills for HUD and other agencies. But I'm growing more and more concerned about what is going to happen in February. So I just want to put this on your radar for now. So some Republicans are pushing for a full year continuing resolution. So that essentially would mean carrying over funding levels from last year for this year. But even though it sounds like a level of funding, it really results in a cut to housing programs. And that's because it doesn't add additional resources that are needed to address inflationary costs and other costs that increase over time. This is a major issue when it comes to rental assistance. As you know, rental assistance works on the private market. So as rents rise, so does the cost of rental assistance. And we might be able to get an anomaly or another provision that are in the bill to move the funds around. But if the overall cap of spending for HUD stays in place, it means that other HUD programs could get cut too. So either way, this is not a good situation to have a long year, full year CR, but it's something that seems to be something that Republicans are talking seriously about, and we need Republican votes to get these bills through. Normally in the past, Congress would reach an agreement with Democrats and Republicans to increase both defense spending and domestic programs. And there was some trade-off there, right? Everybody got a little bit more money. But this year, Republicans are saying, we don't care about increases to the defense. We want a full year CR. So that changes the dynamic in terms of what possible deal there might be to be made. It's something we're paying close attention to. As I mentioned earlier this week, we sent a letter with our friends at the Campaign for Housing and Community Development Funding to raise concerns about a full year CR and to encourage Congress to pass a bill as quickly as possible. I'm going to share a link in the chat box for those of you who want to sign on to that letter. But just as a heads up to all of you, after the Build Back Better Act passes, hopefully end of this month, we'll shift our attention to this appropriations bill to make sure it gets through. And just as a reminder, in terms of what's at stake, this year we saw really significant proposals to increase housing programs, especially on the House side. The House bill would have expanded rental assistance to 200,000 households, additional households. So it's really major increases. And unlike the Build Back Better Act money, once this money is included into the HUD budget, it's very likely that we can keep those funding increases going forward. So really important stuff. Just want to flag for all of you. And with that, I will turn it back to Paul to see if there are any questions.
Thank you, Sarah, as always. And Meredith Dodson has a question. Can you share anything about when the Banking and Housing Committee, Senate Banking and Housing, officially will review and submit or move forward their piece of the Build Back Better reconciliation bill? She says, I know Finance and HELP committees are doing that today. Any specific advocacy or amplification needed around that?
I don't think there's any need for advocacy around that. What Meredith is talking about is work that's being done behind the scenes by committee staffers to make sure that everything in their bill lines up with the rules of budget reconciliation. They've been working with the parliamentarian to go over that bill language. From what I hear, I haven't heard specifically that the housing provisions have been submitted, but I have heard that Schumer has put in a deadline of Wednesday of this week to have all the committees finish their process. And I expect that that would likely happen with the HUD programs, housing programs as well. So I'm not worried about that. I think the larger issue is we can have a perfectly written bill and it can have all these resources in it, but if we can't get it across the finish line in the Senate, then it doesn't really mean much. So I would focus all of our energy on talking to your Democratic senators and House members and really putting that pressure on them to pass the final bill as quickly as possible.
And Sarah, is there any intelligence that we or anybody else has that you've heard of about, whether Schumer has indicated to any of those committees, hey, we ought to pare back this or that because of anticipated opposition from Manchin or Sinema on this or that piece?
So I haven't heard any pressure from Schumer to cut down housing resources.
I'm not talking necessarily just about housing, just across the board.
Just in general.
Yeah.
I know that there is, in the places where Manchin, Sinema, and congressional Democrats don't agree are places like the SALT deduction, state and local tax deduction, paid family leave, the climate change provisions. But outside of those specific issues, I haven't yet heard anything about cutting overall spending down in the bill, which obviously would have a big impact on housing. But it is something that we're paying really close attention to. The further out that Manchin and Sinema can drag this bill into January, maybe beyond, right? The more leverage they have potentially to cut resources overall in the package. Right now, remember, they went from $3.5 trillion to $1.75 trillion. We have to be really vigilant to make sure that top line number doesn't come down, because of course, if it does, that could have a huge impact on housing. Haven't heard about that yet, but something all of us should be aware of and concerned about. And it also gives us a lot more, underscores how important it is for us to be putting as much pressure on Congress as possible to pass this bill as quickly as possible.
And is there also a concern that if it does get punted into 2022, all of a sudden the urgency for getting it done, which right now, before Christmas, got to get it done before Christmas, goes away?
Yeah, so there's a couple of factors here. I mentioned earlier that the child tax credit expires in December. That is a really important thing that I'm sure members of Congress are thinking about in terms of timing. But you're right, if it moves into January, we get into trouble with the midterm elections, right? The closer we are to midterms, the harder it is for Congress to pass really big, bold, transformative legislation. It becomes harder to keep Democrats all together on the same page. It's already been a high rope wire act of trying to keep everyone very much on the same page. I think that we might start to see people fall off if this bill continues to get stretched out, or maybe there's just less urgency to get it done. So in order to counteract that, we need to be putting as much pressure as possible to force Congress to take up the bill as quickly as possible and finally enact it.
All right, very good, Sarah. Thank you as always. Really appreciate that update. We will now move on in our agenda. Okay, and we have with us a friend to the coalition, Eric Tarz from the National Homelessness Law Center, legal director there, who's going to talk about a new report on state level criminalization of homelessness. And I will turn it over to you now, Eric.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks to the whole coalition, and thanks for putting up the first slide. I'm excited to be here and tell you a little bit about our report. I'm dropping some links into the chat. You can access the full report on our website at the link here. And we did a full webinar of our own last week that we're having technical difficulties posting, but once it goes up, the link is there in the chat. Next slide, please. So this report is a complement to our fuller report, which is at the municipal level, and we put out in 2019. So this is just covering this findings at the state level, what laws at the state level criminalize homelessness, as opposed to what happens at the municipal level. And although one of the most surprising findings of the report is that almost every state has some form at the state level criminalizing homelessness, criminalization is actually much more common at the municipal level. So it's important to remember that even if a state doesn't show up on this map or on some of the other maps in the report, that doesn't mean that people aren't experiencing criminalization. It just means it's not at the state level. It's not from due to a state level statute. Next slide. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of the findings here. There's more in the report, but the first is that 17 states do criminalize camping in public places, and that camping is often very broadly defined and could even include simply pulling a blanket over yourself. So it doesn't necessarily mean you have to even put up a tent or anything like that. I do want to highlight specifically Texas for its law, which was passed just this past summer, which not only creates a statewide camping ban, but actually penalizes communities that would try to under-enforce the law with prosecution by the state attorney general's office, and potentially threatens all of the state funding for that municipality. And this law was passed with the help of a right-wing think tank called the Cicero Group, and we know that they are using it as a model for other states. So we want to make sure that folks are aware of this and to be on the lookout for copycats in their states. There's also was action in Austin itself, the state capital, and so it could be coming, versions of it could be coming at the municipal level as well. So just be on the lookout for that. Next slide. 32 states, we found criminalized loitering, loafing, or vagrancy laws. And these are often intentionally written very vaguely to allow the police discretion about who they decide is allowed to occupy public spaces. Many of them originated as part of Black codes in the Jim Crow era, deliberately designed to allow police to criminalize formerly enslaved persons who didn't have current employment and force them back through the 13th Amendment loophole into conditions of forced labor. And those laws, not surprisingly, continue to have the same effect today. That said, even some of the northern states have very broad laws, and Wisconsin, for example, criminalizes any person, quote, with the physical ability to work who is without lawful means of support and does not seek employment. So if you're unemployed in Wisconsin, you could be breaking the law. And that's obviously very problematic in terms of who it's most likely going to be enforced against. Next slide. I know this group reaches a lot of people who might not otherwise be familiar with issues around criminalization of homelessness. So I just want to say briefly why it's important. Criminalization harms us all because it puts the responsibility for dealing with homelessness in the hands of the police, who only have a few tools in their tool belts, their guns, their handcuffs, and their citation books. What they don't have is the tools to build affordable housing. But it costs 2 to 3 times as much to cycle people experiencing homelessness through jails and courts as it does to put them into housing. So every dollar that we send to the police to work on this is $2 or $3 that don't go to building affordable housing we actually need to end homelessness in our communities. And so with that, our kind of recommendations are to repeal these laws criminalizing homelessness at the state level and at the local level, to support statewide homeless bills of rights or right to rest acts, and to, if communities are having challenges with encampments, they could be using the temporary housing funding from FEMA for non-congregate shelter. Right now, we could close every encampment across the country by putting people into hotels, all on FEMA's dime, but instead many communities continue to spend their own money to put people into jails, which simply doesn't make sense. Next slide. And there is also federal legislation out there, the Ending Homelessness Act, the Housing is a Human Right Act, the Unhoused Bill of Rights, all of which would provide incentives for communities to turn away from criminalization and put money into affordable housing, which is what we need and folks should be pushing for those too. So you've got all of our social media here, and I'm happy to take questions.
Great, Eric. Thank you so much. So there are a few questions that have come in. One by Shelley Coase, I think is her name. Can you specify how loafing is defined in these laws? You said very vaguely, but do they have a definition? What is loafing?
Yeah. Often, we kind of group these laws together because they're very similar, but they use varying terms. And so, yeah, it just could mean like being in a public place without a visible means of support, without an objective purpose, and so it's a kind of thing like somebody who spreads a blanket on a park lawn, if they are there for a picnic and they're dressed nicely, then that's, just having a picnic. But if they're spreading a blanket because they need a place to sleep and they don't have another place, that's loafing or vagrancy or some other thing. And that's how these laws are written, and that's how they're enforced. So yeah, I don't have a loafing off the top of my head. I did just see a new one being offered in Dover, Delaware, which was called dawdling. So, they keep coming up with new terms, but it's all the same sort of thing.
Yeah. Jerry Poe asks if there's a model state law that you could recommend. Now, you stated that 48 states have some sort of restriction, criminalization of homelessness. Is there a state that has a really progressive law on its books that you might recommend?
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of a law criminalizing homelessness, the best law, the most model law criminalizing homelessness is a repealed law criminalizing homelessness. Right. So there's no kind of good form of camping law. We often get asked this question, like, is there a way we can just criminalize some people or not have it be so bad? More notice before an encampment is evicted, a little bit better, but the best law is no law at all. So I'll start with that. And then, other things like all sorts of complementary policies, renters protections to prevent evictions, and affordable housing funding in the first place. Those are the kinds of laws we need to see passed. There are, as I said, these homeless bills of rights or right to rest acts. The ones that have been passed in Connecticut, Illinois, and Rhode Island haven't been very strong because they've been watered down through the process. The ones that are stronger, the right to rest acts that have been introduced in California, Oregon, Washington, and Colorado are much stronger, but they haven't passed. So if you want to look at model legislation, I'll find a link here for the Western Regional Advocacy Project, which has been promoting these homeless bills of rights or right to rest acts, and those are the models I would look at.
Great. So our participant, Rachel Effenbein, looks like this is her last name. Do you have the exact research that shows that it costs 2 to 3 times as much to police homelessness than to house the homeless? We are trying to advocate for local affordable housing tax and need such research to substantiate our argument to the county commissioners.
Yeah, there's a study from the Central Florida Homelessness Commission or something like that, coalition maybe. If you go to our main report, the 2019 Housing Not Handcuffs report that I linked earlier, that has a lot of the cost study data from a variety of sources, but that Central Florida one, I believe, is where we got the 2 to 3 times figure.
And can you say anything about the CDC's guidance against encampment sweeps? and any impact that's having on localities' policing and practices?
Sure. So we lobbied early on. We realized that one of the worst things that you could do for a person experiencing homelessness who's living in an encampment would be to evict them from that encampment, forcing them to mix around in the community, to potentially have to go to either a congregate jail or a congregate shelter facility where they would be much more likely to be exposed to COVID. And in fact, that's what we did see early on, that homeless shelters were COVID hotspots. And so we got this guidance saying that you should not evict an encampment, but rather should be providing them with on-site sanitation services, unless you can put people into individual hotel rooms. And as I said, FEMA is offering 100% reimbursement to communities for putting people into non-congregate shelter right now. So every encampment could be given that treatment, but they aren't. What we saw was this guidance was initially effective, that a lot of communities did back off on their evictions and did get some people into housing or into hotels. California obviously took it on in the most substantial way with Project Roomkey, but other states and localities did as well. But it was a very underutilized resource to use the FEMA reimbursement. So it's only in a couple dozen communities at most, outside of the state of California, which kind of took it on statewide. But the problem that we're seeing now is kind of that initial concern for the people experiencing homelessness and tolerance of these encampments has now, because the police allowed them to remain, many of them grew larger as people who were encamped in more dangerous areas came into these more open areas. And so the encampments grew, and as the encampments grew, and then as people started coming back to work and seeing them in their downtown areas or whatever, you start to get the pushback again. And so now we're kind of seeing the pendulum swing back towards an increased push to criminalization, despite the fact that the CDC guidance is still in effect. So we definitely continue to push the CDC guidance as really important, but it's not necessarily having the same effect as people kind of tire of other aspects of the pandemic.
Is there anything that the National Homelessness Law Center is able to do, I don't know, with partners or your own sort of communications and media outreach team, whatever, to really get the word out about this and publicize the report, get people talking about it's 2 to 3 times more expensive to criminalize homelessness than it is to give people affordable housing? Any thoughts about getting that word out more pervasively?
We're doing everything we can. We're here today. This is part of our strategy because we know there's what do we see, 444 of the folks who are most likely to be talking about this. So we're on Twitter. Follow us on Twitter. We're going to be kind of doing a longer term effort to keep the data circulating on social media, so tweeting, retweeting, that sort of thing. If folks want to write op-eds, we're happy to work on that with people. Our Housing Not Handcuffs website has some template op-eds on it that are more general, but you can use this report to key to as a kind of a news hook. And definitely I recommend whatever state that folks are in, they can look at the data for their state and say, this is how we compare. So, whether you're doing really well or you're not doing so well, or you're like a surprise, like New Hampshire has one of the most restrictive camping bans. You wouldn't expect that in New Hampshire. So there's a news hook somewhere in there for every state, and we're happy to to work with folks. I will drop my email in the chat so people can be in touch if they want help with that.
And Eric, do you have any suggestions for communities on how to get them to use their FEMA funds the way you guys are recommending?
I mean, I think, first you have to sell the community on it, but the sale is really like, you can, elected official, you could be the one to remove every encampment in your community, which is of course what people are asking for, but you can do it in a constructive way, using federal funds, no local dollars. This is really going to be a win-win for everybody involved. And these funds are available, and they're available through the end of April. I think what we have seen in some communities is that they're reluctant. They know these FEMA dollars are going to go away eventually, and they're concerned about the appearance of needing to take people who were in hotels and put them back onto the streets, because they don't feel like they're going to be able to provide more permanent resources. So you're going to have to overcome that. And I think the bigger thing to overcome is the sense that this is better than people deserve. We have this mentality of prejudice against people experiencing homelessness, that the best that they should be able to ask for is, a bunk in a congregate shelter, and to give somebody the dignity of a private space with their own bathroom is somehow, above them. And so, and some hotel chains have been reluctant to damage their brand by hosting people experiencing homelessness. So you're going to have to overcome those sorts of things. But it really is a tremendous opportunity. And, for a lot of people, just that little bit of stability could give them the chance to find permanent employment once they don't have to, be looking for their, the place they're going to stay that night, or where they're going to shower. Then they can have a shower and go to a job interview and keep their clothes in a nice place and things like that. So it could lead to a permanent change in many communities for at least some individuals, even though it's a temporary resource. But then, I think the Low Income Housing Coalition has some good resources. The National Alliance to End Homelessness has some good resources. And the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness has good resources on taking advantage of this, the FEMA money. So those are the other places where I would look.
Fantastic, Eric. And I will just echo what a number of people have put in the chat, which is thank you for this. It's really phenomenal research and such important information. And we're really glad to have you join us for today's call, and your presentation and your answering of all the questions has been fantastic. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, take care. Okay, we will now move on to the End Rental Arrears to Stop Evictions, ERASE group at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And for an update on ERA spending, Emma Foley, research analyst here at the Coalition, will take it away. So Emma?
Thanks, Paul. So last Monday, the Department of the Treasury released updated emergency rental assistance spending data through October 31st. And this data revealed that an additional $2.2 billion in the first round of emergency rental assistance, or ERA-1, and $666 million in the second round of emergency rental assistance, or ERA-2, was spent in the month of October. Overall, $13.1 billion from ERA-1 and 2 has been dispersed to households, reaching over 2.5 million renter households. And just as a reminder, ERA-1 is the initial round of emergency rental assistance totaling $25 billion from the 2021 Consolidated Appropriations Act. And ERA-2 is the second round of emergency rental assistance totaling $21.6 billion from the American Rescue Plan. Next slide. After steady increases in monthly spending for ERA-1 since the program's start, October marked the first month where spending for ERA-1 decreased, which you can see in the blue bars in this graph. Despite this decrease, though, ERA-2 spending more than tripled between September and October. This trend highlights the continual uneven performance of ERA programs. While around 100 programs have spent almost all of their ERA1 allocation and are transitioning to that second allocation. Other ERA1 grantees continue their slow spending. For example, 95 grantees have still spent less than 1/3 of their initial ERA1 allocation. Next slide. State grantees have spent 48% of their ERA1 allocation, up from 38% in September, and have spent 4% of their ERA2 allocation. Several states have already spent a significant portion of their ERA2 funds, including the state of New Jersey, which reports spending 67% of their total ERA2 allocation, followed by the District of Columbia at 27%, Maine at 21%, and California at 10%. One thing to note is the state of Maine has stopped spending their ERA1 in favor of ERA2, resulting in this relatively high ERA2 spending rate. Local grantees spent 68% of their total ERA1 allocations by the end of October and 8% of their ERA2 funds. Over 100 local grantees have started spending ERA2, with many large cities and counties already spending a significant portion of their allocation. Austin, Texas, New Orleans, Louisiana, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Harris County, Texas have all reported spending more than 60% of their ERA2 allocations already. Next slide. This graph shows state grantees that have spent more than 50% of their ERA1 allocation, or less than 15% as of the end of October. 13 states have spent more than half of their ERA1 allocation, with New York, California, New Jersey, and DC continuing to kind of lead the pack, spending nearly 90% or more of their allocations. And you might notice that New York in this graph has spent over 100%, which is likely because they're also reporting spending for some localities that have funneled their funding to the state program. Many other states continue to fall behind, though, with 14 states having spent less than 15% of their allocation by the end of October. It's likely that many of these states will have some of their funds reallocated due to their low spending rates, but Treasury has not yet published the amounts to be recaptured from specific grantees. Next slide. NLIHC continues to track ERA spending in real time, which provides slightly more updated numbers on what funding has been paid out or approved for households. As of this morning, we're tracking $13.5 billion in emergency rental assistance one funding that has been paid or approved to households. This represents about 60% of that initial $25 billion allocation. Next slide. And we have also begun tracking ERA2 funds in our public spending tracker. As of this morning, our tracking indicated that $2.4 billion of the ERA2 has been approved or paid, which is approximately 13% of the ERA2 allocation. The majority of this funding, you can see, is coming from states, and the states that have paid or approved most of this funding are New York, Texas, New Jersey, and California. Information for each individual state grantee can be found in our spending database that's linked here at bit.ly/ERA-spending. Next slide. And as always, if you have questions about ERA program spending or reallocation, or if you have any updates to data that we've posted publicly, please do feel free to email us at research@nlihc.org. And I'll stop there and pass it back to you, Paul.
Great. So there's one question, and I have a couple of others. So one of the questions from an anonymous attendee is, for states that are underspending, is it due to the lack of infrastructure to process the applications, or are people not applying?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'd say it varies across states. So certainly in some places there is a lack of infrastructure, whether that be staff capacity or technological infrastructure that really hasn't been updated for this kind of massive influx of funds. Another reason we've seen places spend slowly is because they haven't integrated some of the flexibilities that would allow them to process applications more quickly and that allow tenants to more easily apply. So this includes things like allowing tenants to self-attest to meeting different requirements, or using things like fact-specific proxy to determine a applicant's income. But then I do think that in some places, and we've said this since the beginning, the actual emergency rental assistance allocation was a bit uneven. And so places with a large number of low-income renters received proportionately less than places with a much smaller number of low-income renter households. And so in those cases, we might see spending happening much faster in places like New York, just because the need is so much higher, and they received proportionately fewer funds than maybe smaller states.
So Emma, can you just explain, you just said it very quickly there, and I'm not sure everybody understands what you meant when you said it. So when you're talking about self-attestation, I think that's relatively straightforward. It's basically that many of the best programs, the highest spending programs, the programs that are getting their money out to renters in need, are allowing for self-attestation rather than requiring lots of documentation about income or need or whatever. But you also mentioned fact-based proxy. Could you just explain what that is?
Yeah, of course. So one of the updates to Treasury guidance in the last several months includes that places can use something called fact-specific proxy to determine income for applicants. And so this could include, essentially this allows applicants to self-attest to meeting the income requirements, but also uses some other kind of support as a proxy that says this person is likely to meet the income requirements. And so in most places, that's a geographic proxy. So does a person live in a census tract or a zip code where the majority of residents are low income? In other places like Massachusetts, they're using a fact-specific proxy that relies on being enrolled in other social programs within the state. And so it can vary, but generally it kind of takes the onus off of the applicant from providing onerous income documentation, allows them to self-attest to meeting those requirements, and then also provides program with kind of a backup that says this person is likely to meet income requirements.
Great, thank you. Two kind of related questions here are, has Treasury indicated at all when they will announce reallocations, when we'll hear about reallocation of funds from underperforming areas?
Not that we have heard of. I think, we expect it to happen soon, especially because technically the second round of reallocation is supposed to be based on data as of the end of November, which has already passed. We have been seeing news articles about, some places that are voluntarily reallocating funds, particularly states that are voluntarily reallocating funds to high-performing local grantees, which might offer funds to places that might still have high need and have used all their funds, and also helps kind of bolster the spending rate for those states. But we haven't heard from Treasury exactly when they will be publishing that information.
Thanks, Anna. And one other question, you mentioned Maine is like shifted from, okay, we're not going to do ERA 1 anymore. We're going to use ERA 2. I think because in the statute itself, there's many more flexibilities for them to be able to use that more easily. Are there other states that seem to be following that suit that really want to use ERA 2 because it's easier to use? And is there any indication that a state like Maine would say, so we're going to allow our ERA 1 to be reallocated because we want to use ERA 2?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I haven't seen any other states do quite what Maine has done, which is essentially completely stop dispersing ERA 1 funds. There are some states that are dispersing ERA 1 and ERA 2 funds at the same time. Maybe that's because someone who applies might be eligible for ERA 2, but not for ERA 1, or maybe it's because a program is paying out an additional 3 months to households that received ERA2 but are eligible for more rent in the future. What was this was a two-part question. I forgot the second part of your question.
Whether there's any indication that a state like Maine would say, go ahead and reallocate my ERA1 because we're only going to use ERA2.
Right. It's a bit of a complicated situation because technically states only received 40% of their ERA2 allocation. And based on a press release from the Department of Treasury, they've said that programs can only receive the additional 60% of their ERA2 allocation if they've also spent a significant amount of their ERA1 allocation. So it seems like that might not be a super sustainable strategy for moving forward with those ERA2 funds.
Great. Thank you so much, Emma. There are a number of comments that have come in the chat, and there's a question in the Q&A that we don't have time to answer now. If you want to take a look at those and answer them offline, that'd be great. Thank you so much, Emma. Okay, we will move on in our agenda, and we will move to our good friends from the Utah Housing Coalition. Tara Rollins, the Executive Director, and Sherry Whitwer, board member of the Utah Housing Coalition, will take it away. So I will turn it to you now.
Thank you. I really want to thank the National Low Income Housing Coalition for inviting us today to present the work that we're being done in Utah in response to an audit done by the Utah Office of Legislative Auditors. It was entitled In-Depth Follow-Up of the Oversight and Management of Utah's Homeless Service System. And those of us who listened to the auditors were shocked by the response saying that permanent supportive housing was not working, that people were staying too long. That's right. You heard me right. They weren't moving out. What part of permanent supportive housing did they not understand? Permanent or supportive? We responded by having a webinar in a press conference, and it was sponsored by Crossroads Urban Center, Disability Law Center, and the Utah Housing Coalition. We really felt that we need to respond to what was being said. And also to talk about what it means for permanent supportive housing to our community. And if we have time, I will talk about next steps after Sherry presents.
Thanks, Tara, and thank you for the opportunity to share some thoughts today. My name is Sherry Whitwer, and I've worked in the mental health system in Utah in a variety of capacities, and I've always been a mental health advocate. However, my work through the years and through the opportunity to be informed by individuals with lived experience, that has led me to become a housing advocate. With the current public discourse on mental health, we need to draw a direct line to housing. We know housing is healthcare, and there simply is not a more critical need for individuals affected by serious mental illness than having access to safe, affordable, decent housing with the necessary supports to help them stay housed. And this is permanent supportive housing. Over the years, supportive housing has shown to not only improve outcomes, but reduce healthcare costs when provided to those individuals who have the most complex needs. When someone stays long-term in housing, that is the desired outcome, and it shows the model is working. Our public systems and community providers, and we heard about the criminalization of homelessness earlier, are very familiar with the challenges of individuals who cycle through facilities and systems repeatedly. And while we may have made some progress in the development of crisis response systems in the mental health arena, we have much work to do on preventing crisis from happening in the first place. Too often, rather than focusing on the development of home and community-based services for those individuals affected by mental illness, The only solution discussed is to build more psychiatric beds and facilities. Yet, for the cost of one night in a psychiatric facility or similar levels of care, we could pay the rent for an individual for about a month. And when people are discharged from these settings but do not have housing, any therapeutic gains the person may have received are lost. And in fact, they may have been further traumatized from the experience. We can put people in restrictive levels of care for a time, but nothing fundamentally changes about their life circumstances. They return to living on the street or in otherwise unsafe or inadequate conditions without the basic necessities of life, let alone the ability to access effective mental health treatments. We need to change our mindset from beds to housing units. Permanent supportive housing coupled with access to evidence-based mental health services such as peer support, assertive community treatment or ACT teams, and reliable and effective case management services can provide the highest level of community-based care for individuals at risk of cycling through multiple systems, who are at risk for institutionalization or coming out of restrictive settings. The social determinants of health are the non-medical factors that influence health and mental health outcomes, and they include basic needs. Safety and housing are important components of the social determinants of health. There's a lot of work being done in this area, but permanent supportive housing is where people go to live, not to be contained. When people have stable housing, they can focus on the activities of living: jobs, education, health and mental health, relationships, community and social connection, the things all of us want. If we want to truly help people affected by serious mental illness, and if we want sound policy solutions that will reduce the burden on our homeless service systems, law enforcement and first responders, courts, corrections, and emergency rooms, we must first look to housing. When we provide a variety of housing options with services and supports based on individual needs, we will break the cycle and be able to provide quality, cost-effective solutions that focus on the individual's long-term stability, independence, development, and dignity. Thank you.
Thank you, Sherry. Really appreciate that. And I'll turn back to Tara. I think you wanted to say a few words about moving forward.
Yes. And so one of the things that happened right before this audit came out was a request for $200 million, to spend on extremely low income housing, really deeply subsidized. And so it was kind of a shock when this audit came out, and that's why we felt like we really needed to do more than just a press conference. And so we had quite a few people speak on the subject. And so our next steps are, one, we're sending a letter to the auditor's office and with new information, not new information to us, but new information to them to support permanent supportive housing. Two, we're also putting a one-pager together to include with, to present to the Executive Appropriations Committee, who is meeting tomorrow. And we are expecting the governor's budget to come out anytime, and we want to see three figures there. We want to see at least $100 million, so then we can fight for more during our legislative session. Three, also, the state is preparing a report to our Commission on Housing Affordability to talk about the capital stack of these programs. And so, as we talked about during our press conference, what the state is actually putting in as an investment is only covering $15,000 a unit. And so they're really getting a bang for their buck in terms of other people, other like private sector subsidizing. And we also did highlight the money that was going in federally through the National Housing Trust Fund. And so that will be a presentation, hopefully either next week or the beginning of the year. And then fourth is we're going to do a postcard campaign, and we're going to be reaching out to Parent Supportive Housing and having each one do like 5 postcards on 5 different individuals. And we will be handing those out with the pictures and comments from the person that lives there and how important that housing is to them. And we'll be handing those out on a daily basis on the Hill during our 45-day session that starts in January. So those are some of the things that we're doing to try to debunk this audit. And we feel good about the work that we have done. And we've received, good press on it, and it has been well received. So thank you. And I put the audit in the chat.
Fantastic. Tara and Sherry, thank you so much for that presentation. There is a question from Jerry. How are faith communities in Utah responding to this assault on compassionate community values?
Well, that's an interesting question. So the Crossroads Urban Center actually heads up the coalition of religious communities. And so they have been doing, a lot of outreach, and they do a lot of press conferences on this particular issue. And so they also do once a week, they have people on the Hill, working on these type of issues. And
has there been an initial reaction from state legislators and others to the audit findings?
Yes, I would have to say yes. I think that we have new leadership out of the governor's office that is working on homelessness. And so he did a very brief response to it, but we all understand that there has been much talk about this particular issue because one of the great things has been is that we have somebody that really didn't know anything about homelessness, but yet used to be the president of the Senate here. And he took this serious and he dove in deep, and he goes out every Friday night with his wife and he walks our community and talks to people who are experiencing homelessness and what they want. And so he has been throughout our state, also interviewing all our providers and wanting to know what would be best practices, et cetera. And so he actually has a really good grasp on permanent supportive housing. He is the one who put the $200 million request forward. And so I think that the response that the community has had, as well as the state who covers, homelessness issues, has had a good a pushback on those items that were found in the audit.
In part, I was wondering, though, if there's a big response to people who don't want to support permanent supportive housing, if there's been like, whoa, this is terrible, and there's been a big reaction negatively about the report as well, that you really have to fight.
No, you know what? I'd have to say that I think it came off as really, I don't want to say ignorant, but they didn't do their homework. They didn't really reach in to find out what permanent supportive housing was. They just saw it as a piece of inventory that, okay, they leave the shelter, but yet we're not moving people, cycling people through. They have this chart that showed people just kind of going in this circle. But yet, as our leader in homelessness right now says, the most important part is housing and case management. If we don't have the case management, they're going to start circling through again. And so there has been a big emphasis and talking about that particular piece as well. But we only get $2 million a year in affordable housing so this is pretty bold request for $200 million. It just shows the support of the governor's office to housing. And to me, that is success.
Great. So here's one other question Mary S. Says, can constituents from other states assist in writing postcards?
Yeah, we'd love it if there's other people that are being successful in their housing. I mean, it would be really, because as we are addressing what is happening with, Build Back Better, we're always saying that our state and nation, we're trying to be one, because it goes across, state lines. And so we need to stand united. And especially if we have, best practices happening in other states, we'd love to see it.
Well, and it looks like Mary S. at least is offering to help you guys out. So Mary, there is the emails there. If you want to reach out and say, how can I help? That would be great. All right. Tarz giving the thumbs up to that. All right, Sherry and Tara, thank you so much. We're going to move on in our agenda now. I think we are very close to having the senator join us, so we may need to make a shift in our agenda. I'm just taking a look at some chats being directed directly to me. I warned Adrienne Bush from Kentucky this may happen, and she was fine with that. She said, I understand. So let's just see if Senator Patty Murray is about to join us. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do a little introduction of Senator Murray, and then hopefully during that period of time, she will be able to join us. So Senator Murray represents the state of Washington and currently serves as a member of the Senate Democratic leadership. Throughout her career, she has worked to help workers, families, and communities. She is currently chair of the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, where she has played a key role in addressing the COVID-19 pandemic and crafting the Build Back Better Act, including its historic investments in home and community-based services. She also played a key role in securing investments in childcare, pre-K, and healthcare in the Build Back Better Act. And I believe, as I was presenting this introduction, that Senator Murray has joined us. Is that right, Senator Murray? Are you with us?
I am here. Can you hear me?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Great, great. Well, thank you, Paul, and thank you to everybody who's joined the call today with the National Low Income Housing Coalition. The work that all of you do is so important to the health and well-being of all of our families and our communities. And I will tell you, as a voice for Washington State, there's not a single community that I visit, whether it's in downtown Seattle or the suburbs of Spokane, where the cost of housing is not at the forefront of everybody's minds. In my state, our legislature and our local governments are continuing to make affordable housing a priority. Our local nonprofits are continuing to punch above their weight to keep folks safely housed. But the truth is, we cannot meet the full scope of this housing crisis in Washington State and across America without some major federal action. I don't need to tell anybody on this call about how we had a housing crisis before this pandemic. In Washington State, before COVID, from January 2019 to January 2020, we had the third largest increase in people experiencing homelessness in the country. That's more than 1,300 additional people in my state without housing. That was before COVID. And then COVID-19, of course, really sent our local communities and housing providers just absolutely reeling. During the pandemic, we've seen more people who are grappling with housing insecurity and homelessness, especially people of color and people with low incomes. Now, the American Rescue Plan that we passed earlier this year made a really big difference. We got shots into arms. We got people back to school and back to work safely. We're getting America back up and running again. And there would be no economic recovery like we've seen without that American Rescue Plan. I actually just spoke with some constituents from my state last week who credited the American Rescue Plan's emergency housing vouchers with keeping them safely housed and helping them get back on their feet. So we know that the American Rescue Plan saved millions of lives and livelihoods. But the housing relief that we got in that bill, thanks, by the way, in large part to the amazing advocacy of many of you who are on this call, can't fully address a problem that we know goes a lot deeper. According to the Census Bureau data, this fall, nearly 1 in 10 renters in Washington state were not caught up on rent. So here we are in December, on the verge now of passing the Build Back Better into law. It is, as you know, made its way through the House, and now we are negotiating and finalizing this bill in the Senate as we speak. As of right now, we've secured more than $150 billion investment in housing. It's not everything we wanted when we started this process, but it will still deliver the largest federal investment in affordable housing in our country's history. It's an important start, and we will keep fighting for more. But what Build Back Better will mean is building and repairing 1 million affordable homes across our country, including our nation's critical public housing infrastructure. It will boost housing supply and reduce price pressures for renters and homeowners. More federal dollars for rental assistance, expanding vouchers to hundreds of thousands of additional families, which we all know is so badly needed, and make a real difference for people who can get them. And it will enable hundreds of thousands of first-generation home buyers to purchase their first home and build wealth. So this is more down payment assistance than we have ever done before. And as all of you know, it's not just about funding. This legislation will create more equitable communities through community-led redevelopment projects in historically under-resourced neighborhoods. It will remove lead paint from hundreds of thousands of homes. And importantly, it will incentivize state and local zoning reforms that will allow more families to live in higher opportunity neighborhoods. Now, the parts of Build Back Better that deal with housing are really critical. We know how absolutely foundational safe housing is to the overall health and well-being of our families. But I also, while I'm talking to you, want to highlight the proposals in Build Back Better that will help people keep housed and lower their costs. Right now, as we all know, there are families in every part of the country, but I know in my state, they are spending as much as 1/3 of their income to childcare. 1/3 of their income, that's more than their already expensive rent or their kids' college tuition. So we have a childcare proposal in here. It's my childcare proposal that will cap childcare costs for working families at 7%, with a lot of families paying even less or nothing at all for childcare, and will also finally be making free universal pre-K a reality. So that is going to save our families thousands of dollars. And it's not just childcare, it's the expanded child tax credit. It's lowering healthcare costs and prescription drug costs and investments in home and community-based services. Because one of my top priorities is making sure that all older Americans and people with disabilities can live independently. Caregiving is a huge part of making that a reality, but affordable housing is also an important part of that solution as well. Fundamentally, when we lower costs for American families, when we put money back into people's pockets, the way we are going to do through Build Back Better, we are making it easier for families to pay rent or buy their first home or build that real financial security that can last for generations. So here we are, and we are entering the last stretch of the legislative process right now. And my priority and my commitment to all of you is to get this bill over the finish line with all of these life-changing policies that I've just talked about, fully intact by the time the legislation gets to President Biden's desk. So you can count on me to hold the line on affordable housing, on home care, on childcare, and so much more that we know our families are counting on. So thank you again for the opportunity to talk with all of you, and thank you to the entire National Low Income Housing Coalition for your tireless efforts. I'll be fighting right alongside you every step of the way as we get this done. So thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Senator Murray. I just want to say what a phenomenal review of the really historic housing investments, but I'm also really so glad that you not only went through that in some detail for all of our listeners, but also, talked about the impacts of childcare and free universal pre-K and, the expanded child tax credit and those home and community-based services that you talked about that really work alongside housing investments to help address the needs of seniors and people with disabilities so they can remain stably housed and avoid institutionalization and so forth. So thank you so much for that overview, and thank you for all of your work, your leadership on all of this. It's just really, really phenomenal. Just very quickly, I know that your schedule must be really tight. Any advice to us on what we as advocates can do at this last, during this last little phase to get Build Back Better enacted as quickly as possible, along with its historic investments in housing? And do you have any thought at this point when you think Congress will finish its work to enact the bill?
Well, we are working extremely hard right now. We'd like to get it done before Christmas, but we are within weeks of having this bill finalized, go through all the process we have to go through the Senate, get the final language, and bring it to the floor for a very hard and long process, but one that we are just adamant we've got to get through. So very soon. So I would just say to all of you, you've all been working so hard and talking to your legislators and telling them why housing is important. And any of them who don't know just haven't been home and looked around, frankly. But now is the time to really focus on your senator, to let them know how critical the housing parts of this and really all the wraparound services that are so important to the people that you know and see every day, and invite them to housing events with you, talk to them, send them statistics, whatever you do, tell them, get this thing done.
Again, thank you so much, Senator Murray, for your leadership and for joining us on today's call. We so appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you to all of you for being tremendous voices and advocates and storytellers and helping us all get to where we are. And I'm with you on this, in this to the end. So thank you very much.
Take care, Senator Murray. Okay, we will shift back to our last presenter, actually. Adrienne Bush, Homeless and Housing Coalition of Kentucky, will join us now for the last field update. Thank you so much, Adrienne, for taking that little shift in the agenda. Thanks a million.
Yeah, absolutely. It's good to be with you all today. The field staff at NLIHC had asked us to provide more information about our monitoring of the emergency rental assistance deployment in Kentucky, specifically about a survey of recipients we developed in partnership with the ERA administrator. We're privileged to be part of the ERASE cohort, focusing on both the state ERA fund as well as funds being deployed in Louisville, our largest city. We are working with another statewide group, Kentucky Equal Justice Center, and 2 local partners, Coalition for the Homeless and Metropolitan Housing Coalition in Louisville. Today's report is going to focus on the state ERA fund and a survey we developed. So over the summer, we approached our state housing finance agency, which is the administrator for the state ERA fund. In Kentucky, we have 3 jurisdictions that received ERA: Louisville, Lexington, and the State Healthy at Home Eviction Relief Fund. We wanted to develop a survey for renters to provide feedback about their experience with ERA and their housing security prior to COVID-19. We also wanted to survey landlords and property managers who participated in the program. And our state housing finance agency, Kentucky Housing Corporation, was very amenable to working with us. We worked with their program and communication staff to refine our questions, and KHC offered to conduct the survey to minimize any legal or data sharing issues. We have a question at the end asking if they're interested in talking to our staff or story coordinator about their experiences. And the survey went out initially around October 1st. We're working with KHC to disseminate the survey link to new recipients who received assistance over the past 2 months. So some of the questions that we asked, it involved like, are you currently experiencing housing insecurity? Before receiving rental assistance, had you received any of the following from your landlord? We were really trying to get at, did people have trouble making rent before the pandemic? Because the data tells us that generally that's the case, and that the folks who were hardest hit by the COVID-19 pandemic were the people who could least afford it. So those were basically the questions. Some of the questions were more open-ended. And like I said, at the end of it was a chance to connect with our staff. On the quantitative side, because that also is very important, while Louisville and Lexington report that they have expended 100% of their ERA1 and part of the 2.0, the state fund reports that they have obligated over 50% of their grant as of last week. Kentucky, we are very fortunate that all 3 funds worked pretty well together and collaborated from the beginning. And so the state fund, as Emma was talking about, kind of the variances in the formula and how some states and cities needed to adjust. We've been very fortunate in Kentucky that our administrators were willing to work together to make that happen. So $38.7 million has been subgranted to Louisville and Lexington. Overall, $87.7 million has been paid out in assistance for rent, utilities, and internet. 51% is now committed, and there's about $115 million left available to assist Kentucky renters. This all comes from our administrator at Kentucky Housing Corporation, Wendy Smith, the Deputy Executive Director, who is amazing, and I wish every state housing finance agency had one. And lastly, we continue to spread the word formally and informally about both the availability of ERA to ensure housing stability. So with that, I'll take any questions. And if not, I know Paul will be devastated to have to end this early.
Before I do that, I'm not going to let you get away too quickly. So has Kentucky, either the local programs you talked about that have really been doing a phenomenal job, or the state adopted a number of the flexibilities like self-attestation or fact-specific proxy or anything like that?
Yeah, I will say I'm more familiar with the state than I am with the Louisville fund as well as the Lexington, but it is my understanding that where it's been possible, they have adopted self-attestation and really tried to go through the Treasury FAQs to figure out, how can we streamline this,
right.
Make it quicker.
And have you seen like a hockey puck kind of increase from early days to more recently as maybe they've modified their program?
Sure. I would say I was just looking at the expenditure and the obligation data, and it kind of has, overall, it's increased, but it's also been up 1 month, down 1 month, up 1 up, but the overall slope has increased. And then I would say October for the state fund was the highest month so far. So okay. I think overall it's going, the way people want it to.
Great. And are they tapping into ERA2 at this point? You may have said
I don't believe so, but I also don't want to speak for the Housing Corporation. Okay. So I'm not 100% sure on that.
That's fine. That's fine. Thank you very, very much, Adrian, for that report. I don't see other questions in here right now.
I do see, sorry, Paul, I do see a comment from our colleague in Louisville, Natalie Harris, who says that the state did the calculations for Louisville to do fact-based proxies too.
Okay, great.
So I just wanted to highlight that. Thank you, Paul.
Well, thank you for your presentation, for joining us, and also for your flexibility with Senator Murray joining us a little early. Thank you so much, Adrienne. Okay, we are going to close up a little bit early, but just really want to make sure that everybody does everything they can in these final days to reach out to their senators. Right now, that's the most important call, as Senator Murray just talked to us, and urge them to pass the Build Back Better Act and all of those really historic housing investments as soon as possible, before Christmas. Let's get this done. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you to all of our panelists who are wonderful. And we will talk to you next week. Thanks, everybody. Have a great week.